Hello, my name is Ray and welcome to this lesson 1 of Excel Intermediate series tutorial. This is a follow-up to my beginner series, and if you haven't already been through that, feel free to click on the link which should be appearing at the top right hand corner of the screen to access the playlist for those tutorials. In this series we'll be looking at some of the more slightly advanced functions of Excel, and in this first lesson we'll specifically be taking a look at lookups. Lookups are useful in many different scenarios. For example, if you wanted to look up an email address or a telephone number from someone's name, like in an address book, or look up the price of an item in a catalogue, for example. In all scenarios, what you're essentially dealing with is that you have a known value and you want to look up a related value from a table of values. So let's take a look in more detail at what we're going to cover in today's lesson. First, we'll take a look at two basic functions in Excel called VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP. We'll then take a look at a slightly more advanced and complicated method using index and match. And we'll discuss the limitations of each of the methods as we look at them in turn. Now we're going to need some base data for looking at these functions in detail. So if you did complete the earlier tutorials for beginners, please open the lesson 1 register format, or if you don't already have that, you can go to my GitHub page at the link scrolling across the bottom now and download it from there. Or you can just use a table of your own data, as long as it's got a few columns in and quite a few rows where you can look at one value and return another. So I'll give you a few minutes to go do that and join me again when you're ready. Feel free to pause the video. Now we have our data open. Let's imagine a scenario. So let's say that we would like to look up the test score for a particular member of the class. Now what we could do is we could just scroll down the list and look for them, or we could use the sort and filter function to find them. But what if we needed to use that value somewhere else? We would need to be able to retrieve the value and output it to a cell. Helpfully, Excel provides us with a variety of lookup features to achieve this. So let's start just by zooming in on our data a bit so we can see it a bit better by clicking the zoom in the bottom right hand corner. There we go. So we don't really know which functions to use here, so let's just revisit the function search facility and see if we can find something useful. So let's click on the FX here, just next to the formula bar. And what is it that we want to do? Well, let's say we want to look up a value. Look up a value. And then click go. Okay, so it's returned 4 potential functions for us to use: HLOOKUP, LOOKUP, match, and VLOOKUP. We're going to only focus on 3 of these today: the VLOOKUP, HLOOKUP, and match, which is a bit more complicated, so we'll come to that last. So let's look at the description, for example, for HLOOKUP. So what it's telling us is it looks for a value in the top row of a table or an array of values and returns the value in the same column from a row you specify. So for what we want to do, that's not really very useful. So it would be no good looking across a row and then trying to find a value in a column. What we wanted to do was to look down a column and then across. And that function is the VLOOKUP function. So if we look at the description, it looks for a value in the leftmost column of a table. So this is important. So it will only look for a value within the leftmost column of a table. It will then return a value in the same row from a column that you specify. So for example, in our table of data that we have here, we could get it to look for a first name in column A and then return a test score from column E. And that's exactly what we want to do. So let's pick that function, the VLOOKUP function, and then click OK. So when you're using the formula search facility, it helpfully gives you a way of entering the data without needing to type it in. And we can use these little arrows here to pick up what it is that we want to use. So lookup value, if we click on this up arrow, we can then go and click on a cell to pick our value. So let's look up Samantha's score here on row 19 in column A, and then click this little down arrow next to where the function arguments are. And we can see there it's entering lookup value A19, and it's actually telling us that that's going to look up Samantha, which is exactly what we want. Now the table array here is important, so you need to make sure that the table array contains both the value that you want to look up and the value that you want to return. So we want to look up something in column A and return something in column E, so we want to really pick the whole table here. So let's click the up arrow and let's select the whole table just by dragging the mouse. Once again, click the little down arrow in the function arguments box. And there it tells us now that we're going to search the table A6 to E26, and it's given us a brief output there. Next thing that we need to enter is the column index number. So it's important to understand that the column index starts from 1. So column A is number 1, B is 2, etc. So we want to return a value from column E, which is column 5. And the next thing is a range lookup. So it's not immediately obvious what this means. So if you just read the description, so the description it gives for range lookup is a logical value to find the closest match in the first column sorted in ascending order equal to true or omitted. Find an exact match equals false. So we want to look for an exact match here, so we need to enter false. There we go, and it's actually telling us that it's going to return 76. If we click OK, you can see there 76, and if we just double check that, you can see here on row 19, Samantha, and her test score is 76. So I mentioned at the beginning that there are some limitations with this formula, and one of the ones that you can see here is that in column A, we have two Samanthas. We have a Samantha in row 19 and a Samantha in row 26. Now let's imagine that these Samanthas had different scores, so let's just change the value in row 19 to a different value. So let's just put in another value. You can see now there that our value from our VLOOKUP in cell G7 has changed. But now what happens if, for example, we had Samantha here, the bottom Samantha in row 26. Let's put her in class A, by changing that to an A, and let's sort the class column now by A to Z, so it will put class A at the top. So the Samantha now in row 26 will move further above the other Samantha. Let's see what happens. So the first thing that we can see is that the score has now changed to 19. Now that's neither of the Samantha's scores, so why has that happened? If we click on the cell and look at the formula in a bit more detail, we'll be able to understand that. So remember, when we put in the formula, we told it to look up what was in cell A19, because at the time that was Samantha. But now that we've sorted the column in a different way, that's no longer Samantha, that's now William. So this is one of the limitations. So you must bear in mind that it will look up a specific value based on how the column is sorted. So it's never a good idea to look up something that's in a column that might be sorted. So if you did want to use a cell reference, you would put what you wanted to look up somewhere outside of the table, or you could hard put the reference in here. So if we just click in the formula bar and instead of cell A19, we'll just type Samantha in quotes because it's a text string, and now at least it will look up Samantha in the column. But what we can see is that the Samantha it's looked up, if we click here in the formula bar, so we can see it's returned the result from row 18 Samantha, which was 76, but not row 22 Samantha, which is 87. And that again is one of the limitations, so it will find the first value that matches what we've told it to and return the result of that lookup. Let's now look at the second simple lookup function, which is HLOOKUP. And conversely to VLOOKUP, what HLOOKUP does is it looks across a row. So imagine it would look across row 6 here. It would look first name, last name, class, attendance, test scores, and then it would look down the column for whatever we told it to match and return that value. So if we were looking for the same thing, so we wanted to look for a first name and then find a test score, HLOOKUP wouldn't be useful for the table in its current form. So what I'm going to show you now is a way to modify the way this table looks to get it so that all of the headers that we see here in row 6 are actually labels in column A, and all of the other stuff goes across the other way. And this methodology is called transposing, and it's quite useful sometimes for when you're bringing in data from another source and you want it to be displayed in a different way. And how we do this is just to select the whole table, and if we right click on it and then click copy, let's just scroll slightly to somewhere else on the sheet, so down to row 30 for example, right click there, and we're going to select paste special. And what we can see here down at the bottom right, quite near the OK button, is transpose. And let's click OK. And so you can see what it's done here is it's taken our headers that we had in row 6, and it's transposed those into column A. So those are now the labels. And it then takes the data from each of the columns and transposes it into a row. So now we can use the HLOOKUP function to look along row 30 for our name and return what would be in the column. So let's just do that. So let's do the same thing. So we'll do equals HLOOKUP. And we're just typing it in this time. We'll open our bracket. And again, we'll look for Samantha. We'll select our table array by selecting the whole table. We'll do this quickly just by holding Ctrl Shift, pressing down and then pressing right. There we go. And then just click up in the formula bar and put your comma in and continue entering your formula here. So now it's much more difficult now to find our row index number because we can't see it here. But we know that the test value is in the last row, which is the 4th row down. So it's the same as in the VLOOKUP function where column A is number 1, the top row is number 1 in the HLOOKUP function. And the range lookup part is the same, so we're just going to select false for an exact match. If we close our bracket, press enter, and we can see we've actually returned no because it wasn't row 4, was it? It was row 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's just go and adjust that. There we go, it's returned 76. So it works in exactly the same way and also has the same limitations of the VLOOKUP function. So you have to be careful when you're sorting and when you're moving columns around, especially because it only looks up in the first column or the first row. Another limitation of both of these functions is in the example of VLOOKUP, we can look up in the first column and we can then look for anything to the right. But what we can't do is we couldn't, for example, look up a test score and then find out who got that score. We can't look backwards. And in the HLOOKUP example, if we look at this table here, we couldn't, for example, again do the same thing where we would look up a test score and then try and find out who had that, because we can't look before we set our array. However, don't despair because Excel does actually give us a way to do that. But I would get used to using VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP, familiarizing yourself with those before you then start to look at what we're going to look at now. And we're going to use a combination of two formulas called index and match. The match one we saw before when we looked at the functions for lookup, so let's just bring that up again just so you can see. So when we looked up lookup a value, we saw there's something here called match. So let's just click on it and see what it says. So it returns the relative position of an item in an array that matches a specified value in a specified order. Now that's very complicated and it doesn't really sound very good, but let's put the formula in and have a look and see what it actually does. So let's just scroll up to the top of our sheet again, and let's just start by typing equals match and opening the bracket. So what it's asking us for is, again, what do we want to look up? So let's look up Samantha again. It again asks us what lookup array do we want. So we're going to look it up. Now the important thing about match is it's not going to look up in the entire table, and I'll show you what happens if that does. So let's select the whole table again, as though we were doing like a VLOOKUP or an HLOOKUP. Let's put our comma in, and it gives us three options. So we can look for a value that's less than, an exact match, or greater than. So we want to look for an exact match, which is a 0. Let's close our bracket and press enter. And this gives us not applicable. There's an error. There's something wrong with this formula. And what's wrong with this formula is that match cannot look up over multiple columns or rows. So we need to give it the specific column that we want to find the value in. And in our case, it's going to be column A. So let's just adjust that range that we had there and put A colon A. And there we go. So what it's returned is 18. And the reason it's returned that is because Samantha appears in row 18. So match is a way of finding the row of a particular value. And we can then use that in combination with the index command to find other members of that row. Let's now have a look at how we can use this output of the match command within the index function to find the result that we want in column E. So let's start by typing in equals index. And we can see the explanation of the index function is it returns a value or reference of the cell at the intersection of a particular row and column in a given range. So we already have the row from the match function. We found that Samantha was in row 18. So that will form one part, and then we can supply the table as the array that we're going to search for, and we'll tell it the column number, the same as we did in the VLOOKUP function. So let's open the bracket and start typing the formula in. So the first thing that it needs is the array. Now, what's important here is that this array must match what it was that you were looking for in the match function. Now, I'm going to deliberately enter this incorrectly so that you can see what happens. So the array we would assume is just the table. And let's select the whole table. You can see there it's selected A6 to E26. Let's put in our comma. The row number will be supplied by the match function. So we'll click on cell G10 where we entered that match formula, or you could put in the match statement here and enter the parameters. And then the last thing that it needs is the column number, and this works in the same way as the VLOOKUP function, so column E is number 5. And let's close our bracket. Now we can see here that the output result is 41, and this is not the result that we expected, because if we look on row 18, which is where it's telling us Samantha is, it says that the test score is 76. What it's actually returning is this row here from Judith's result, which is 41. And the reason for that is if we look back in more detail at what we entered for the match function. So when we looked for Samantha in the match function, we just looked down column A. So it started at cell A1, and then it went down to Samantha and said, okay, that's 18 rows down. And now in our index function, we didn't start the array until cell A6. So it counted 18 cells down from cell 6, and it found Judith. So we can fix this in one of two ways. So we can either start the match function from A6, or we can set the index array at A1. So we'll just set the index array because that's where we started. That's what we've got in the formula bar. So we'll just click on the formula bar here, just delete the current formula that's in there, and we'll start at this time from cell A1 to the bottom of the table. And now if we enter that formula, we can see now that it returns the correct result of 76. But the power of the index match combination is that we can do something that we couldn't do with VLOOKUP. So what we could have done here is that actually we can look up a test score in column E and return what's in column A. So let's have a look and see how we do that. So let's just go a couple of cells down, and once again we'll type in equals index, open our bracket, and again the first thing we need to give it is the array, so let's just give it the whole table from E6 back to A6, comma, and the next thing we need now is the row number. So unlike before, let's type it out this time. So let's type out the full match statement, so match, open our bracket. So we want to tell it a lookup value, so let's look up 76 again, for example, comma, the lookup array. So this time we're going to look up what's in the test score column, and we're going to return a name. So the test score column is E6 to E26, so let's just highlight that. And the match type, again, we want an exact match, which is 0. And then close the bracket on the match function. We then enter a comma to move on to the next parameter of the index function. And what it needs now is a column number. You can see that highlighted in bold here, that's telling us. And the column number that we want to return this time is, let's return what's in column A, so the first name. And then we'll close the bracket on the index function and press enter. And we can see there now it's returned John. So if we follow through the logic, we can see it started in column E, it looked down, it found the number 76 here, and then it looked across and returned what was in column A, which is John. So that's something that the index match function allows you to do, which you can't do with VLOOKUP or HLOOKUP. You can look at something and you can look to the left of it. But for HLOOKUP and VLOOKUP, you can only ever look in the leftmost column or the topmost row and look in advance of that. However, you will note that it does have the same limitation in terms of when we look at the test score column here in E, we can see there are more than one result for 76, and it only found the first one and then returned what was in it. So that's always, again, just something to be aware of. So it's always a good idea when you're dealing with lookup functions of any kind to make sure that you are dealing with unique values. And you can make unique values in a number of different ways, and we'll look at some of those in later tutorials. But that's everything that we wanted to cover for today, so I hope you enjoyed it. Let's have a look and just refresh a little bit on what we learned in today's lesson. We looked at the functions VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP, which we could use to look up either vertically down a list and then across, or horizontally across a list and then down to return a table value. The limitations of those were that they only allowed us to look in advance of our array, so to the right, for example, in a VLOOKUP, or down in an HLOOKUP. What we couldn't do was look to the left in a VLOOKUP and up in an HLOOKUP. And we observed how we could do that using the index and match function combination. We discussed and had a look at some of the limitations of these functions, including their inability to deal with duplicate values and what happens when you sort tables and how that changes what gets looked up. Now, before I close this lesson, I just want to take a moment to talk about Excel versions. So some of you may have noticed that when you searched in the formula for lookup type functions, there was a function called XLOOKUP. And this appears in later versions of Excel and on Office 365 functions. And it's a more advanced version of the V&H lookup, and in fact an improved version of the V&H lookup. But we're not going to cover that within the scope of today's lesson, but we may visit it at a later time. I hope you found today's content useful, and if you did, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss future episodes. And I hope to see you in the next one.